Can you see my screen?
Starting to share. Yes, now we see your screen. Thank you.
I'll just plug that here.
Ben, are you a chemistry major?
Sorry?
No, just kidding. Are you a chemistry major? I was just asking.
Chemistry major. No, I'll go into my background in a second here. So today I'm going to talk about a book that I wrote called The Periodic Table of Ideas. I'll describe the book. I'll give you some background about myself and answer your question, actually. So I'll give you an overview of the book, and I'm going to talk about philosophy and psychology today. There'll be 4 points in the presentation that'll entertain a question. And I would ask that maybe we hold off on the rest of the questions to the end, because the things in this idea are, every slide could be very rich in conversation if we so wished, and I wouldn't get through the presentation if I just took any question at any time. So a little bit about myself. I'm working currently on ORAN and ONAP, so Open Network Automated Platform. I've worked on 5G use cases and zero touch management. In ORAN, I work in working group 6, cloudification and orchestration, on O2 and in network slicing and various 5G standards. I've worked for 25 years in the wireless industry in 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. I've worked at Lucent, Alcatel-Lucent, Nokia, as many of you have as well, software development, system engineering, architecture. Before that, I was a developer at General Electric Medical Systems, working in ultrasound and MRI, and I have several patents. I did my master's in electrical engineering from Purdue, that answers your question, and a PhD in operations research. I've been to 30 countries around the world on 6 continents. I speak 3 languages. English is my 4th language, and I've forgotten a couple before that since then. So I've lost some as I didn't persistently use some of them. So as I mentioned, I've written 6 books. The latest book came out this year, The Periodic Table of Ideas, and a couple years ago, The 4 Elements of Thinking. I designed a couple of games, and I was the former HeroClix world champion. So a little bit about the Periodic Table of Ideas. So it's a book about pivotal ideas in history. So the ideas in the Periodic Table of Ideas, they span the disciplines of philosophy, science, technology, economics, business, and psychology. I had distilled from 1,190 concepts, some of the most powerful and richest intellectual treasures that are available to us. So I think if you want to make a difference in the world, you can build from some of the most brilliant minds in history and some of the best, most pivotal, most recurrent ideas in history. So the philosophy ideas guide you through your journey in life. Philosophy notions foster critical thinking and provide insights on how to think about the world. The philosophy concepts provide wisdom and mental tools for your endeavors. The science periodic ideas empower your thinking. These scientific concepts allow you to study a subject or tackle a problem, and these notions add tools to your mental toolbox. The technology ideas provide practical tools to propel your projects to success. The products of technology to transform society in every aspect of our lives. The economic periodic ideas give your projects financial footing. Economics indicates where your ideas could thrive and where your efforts might pay off. Economic ideas let you navigate through turbulent markets and ride creative currents. The business periodic ideas show you how enterprises could transform lives, and business concepts could propel your endeavors to success. Psychology periodic ideas give you deep insight to yourself and those around you, and psychology itself explains the workings of your attention systems, perception, and personality. So I chose to, this is really literally the back cover of my book, and the reason I chose this as the text of the slide is because every single sentence and every single word here has been given a lot of thought, and I didn't think I could do any better than the amount of time I poured into these words on this page, because this is your first encounter with my book. Essentially, this is when you pick up the book or look online at it, these are the first words you'll encounter when you encounter my book. So I needed them to be very powerful and impacting and memorable. Okay, so if we look at the periodic table of ideas are broken into 6 major areas, right? And the reason why I chose philosophy and psychology to talk about was because, well, given the audience, you guys are probably pretty familiar with science, technology, and because we're in business, maybe business and economics. So I thought today I would choose some topics that maybe might broaden your horizons a little bit and maybe get you thinking in different ways that maybe you aren't normally thinking about, and to get you to explore the world maybe in a little different way. Okay, so psychology, philosophy, as an introduction, people are naturally curious. Philosophers have pondered and attempted to explain the world around them for thousands of years. The word philosophy itself is derived from the Greek word philosophia, which means the love of wisdom. And philosophy is the study of questions about existence, knowledge, values, reasons, mind, and language. And philosophers seek to answer universal questions like, what's the nature of things? How do we know something is true? What is art? What is justice? What's our moral responsibility? Why are we here? And these questions probe at the very limits of our current knowledge. That's what philosophers do, right? And this is, again, directly straight out of my book from page 17. Okay, so first of all, let's think a little bit about the areas of philosophy. So what are some of the key areas of philosophy? There's 4 basic, big building blocks, big key areas of philosophy. One is logic, so the study of reasoning, arguments, validity, soundness. Another is epistemology. So how do we know what we know? You know, how do we know something to be true? How do we know our beliefs are true? How can we trust something to be true? And how do we justify and validate that something is true? It's an opinion true. Why do we call something a fact? What is a fact? Those kinds of things. Metaphysics is a study of existence. What's real? What's not real? How can we call something reality? What is ultimate reality itself? And then axiology, which are things that don't necessarily have a right or wrong. So you might have, if you've ever gotten to a philosophical discussion about what is art, right? You'll have quickly probably come upon, well, you know, there's lots of different things that people call art, and is that really art? And what is taste, and is that tasteful? So art and things of the axiology form are relative. They're not necessarily black and white, but they're shades of gray in between. So ethics and aesthetics are 2 areas of philosophy that are axiological. But through time, philosophy has actually, philosophy has really touched upon many different areas of knowledge: science, sociology, mathematics, law, linguistics, education, communication, history, theology, economics, politics, art, anthropology, and psychology. And as each of these disciplines has become disciplines in their own right, they've kind of spun off from philosophy. And so philosophy sort of serves as the glue that has served as a foundation to many of these other disciplines that have spun off from philosophy. And that's why today we get, you know, a doctor of philosophy, right? If you've ever wondered what a PhD comes from. So I'm going to be exploring and talking about philosophy in the Western world, but I want to acknowledge that there are many other philosophies that have existed through time and all around the world as well. Native American philosophy has centers around ideas of sovereignty and power, and Latin American philosophy on identity and social philosophy, Afro-Caribbean philosophy of multiculturalism, African and Islamic philosophy, and the various schools of Eastern philosophy, largely highly influenced from Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, but other things like Shintoism and shamanism as well. So in Western philosophy, and anytime you see this little icon, I'm going to stop on this slide for a question. So in timelines of Western philosophy, we see that ancient and the ancient and medieval philosophy, of which you could easily spend many hours a presentation alone on any one of these boxes, really. So I'm going to try to compress a couple thousand years of philosophy in one slide here, and a few key ideas and a few pivotal points. So as you can imagine, that's not an easy task to do. But ancient and medieval philosophy has a couple of key ideas in Neoplatonism and Scholasticism. You see in some of the medieval influences of religion how we're trying to reconcile reason with theology. And of course, the SPA, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, it's a easy way, SPA is an easy way to remember that sequence of philosophers. I'll be talking more about Socrates later on. But one of the big movements we come to is in the Renaissance, in the 15th century, where basically there was a revival of humanism. So the rediscovery of ancient Greek knowledge that had come across through Spain, and really a large influence of science gave rise to rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Malebranche, and the talk of a noumenal world versus a phenomenal world. So we in this period, we have something called an epistemic shift. So we move from a world of so again, these icons tie back to epistemology and metaphysics. So rather than metaphysics driving epistemology, epistemology drives metaphysics. So the famous phrase from Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Before then, it was I am, therefore I think. Right. So that humanism and natural philosophers and rationalists are mark that period. So that the rise of the human spirit, the acknowledgement that human accomplishment is really important, and of course, natural philosophy is what science is really the basis of science. So before science were called scientists, they were called natural philosophers, right? So we come to the empiricists in early modern times, early modern philosophy in the 17th and 18th century, and the empiricists really say that experience is the foundation of knowledge. The impressions that you have that make your mind is how we build knowledge, right? So empiricism is about essentially experiential basis of knowledge, and that's the big key takeaway. I think there, I probably should have highlighted the word experience, but that's the big key thing there. And we come to the Enlightenment, and if you read about the Enlightenment, it's a really interesting period of time where people were in salons and discussing and debating ideas of the time, much like we might in a chat room, let's say, or Facebook, where people. But there was a little bit more directed than that. There were moderators essentially, and they had and asked lots of interesting and entertained lots of interesting questions, and maybe that's why this period of time is called the Enlightenment. But also there were big movements, nationalism, revolutions, and the French Revolution and the revolutionary philosophers, and a lot of people asked a lot of political questions, like what is the best government, and what is justice, and things like that. So and then we come to this remarkable period of time from 1724 to 1924, with that all philosophers today, modern philosophers, recognize as maybe one of the most productive periods of philosophy. And this German idealism was really quite an amazing period of time, all basically founded kind of on Immanuel Kant, who basically, he talked about this categorical imperative and utilitarianism, and we can't know something beyond ourselves, that our knowledge and our senses shape our reality. And then other modern philosophers are the American pragmatists that say that action is important and doing is crucial. Then contemporary philosophy, as science and physics and chemistry and biology kind of chip away at some of the traditional things that philosophers have asked, philosophers find new ways, axiological ways, to explore the boundaries of humanity human knowledge. So there's been a focus on moral and political philosophy, analytical philosophy, existentialism, and questions around those sorts of things. Okay, so I'll stop here for a question. Is there any questions on anything I've said so far? Otherwise, I'll move on.
Yes. Are here for sure. In your previous slide, actually, even the earlier one, yes, this one.
Yeah.
I understood you mentioned this axiology. It's hard to differentiate right or wrong. Or there is always a gray area, right? But then I was wondering how this axiology is actually mapped to the ethics. If we could say that, with ethics, there are moral ethics that are clearly the guiding principles that we can clearly differentiate right from wrong, right?
Yeah, so I think, ethics as an area of philosophy asks questions of morality. What is right and wrong, and why is something right or why is something wrong? And is right and wrong relative? If killing is wrong, let's say, then is a soldier doing something wrong? But if we condone that a soldier can kill in certain circumstances, maybe it isn't so wrong. If a police officer has to kill somebody to protect 5 other people, is that really wrong? Or is that conditionally kind of wrong? Or, and those sorts of gray areas are not necessarily easy to wrestle with, right? Like, when is something alive, and when when does a fetus actually really alive? Those sorts of questions are which don't necessarily have an easy black and white answer. So I'll give you another example in aesthetics, which is also has that sort of relative and in degrees. There's a very interesting book, if you're interested in this kind of topic, is called The $12 Million Stuffed Shark, right? And it's just a fascinating book about modern, the curious economics of modern art. But there's an example there where basically there's this date on a blue field. It's just a date, like October 10th, 1986, on just a blue background. And it's sold for millions of dollars and stuff. And so, but is that really art? And I remember going to the Chicago Museum of Art in Chicago, the Museum of Modern Art one time, and I saw basically there was just a red dot on a blue field, and you have to ask, like, is that really art? Or take a Jackson Pollock painting where he just splashes a bunch of art on, a bunch of paint on a canvas, and is that art or is that not art? It's very subjective. Some of these things are subjective; they're not necessarily black and white. So that's what we mean that these sorts of areas. There are areas in philosophy that are necessarily black and white. Yeah, that's a good question.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're
welcome. Makes sense.
Okay, so I'm going to move on. This just kind of says in words some of the things that I just said verbally. That Neoplatonist is a reverence for reasons and truth, and Scholasticism tried to reconcile logic with some of the ancient thinkers. The humanism is a revival of Greek and Latin culture. And the empiricist, that knowledge comes from experience. The great age of revolution, the French revolutionary thinkers, liberty, equality, and fraternity. The golden century of German idealism, that reality is a construct of the mind. The pragmatism, that the thought is a tool for prediction, action, and problem solving. Okay, and then some of the more modern contemporary thoughts of analytical philosophy, of clarity, of formal logic, and analysis of language, and linguistic, that language is very important in philosophy, semiology, and those sorts of things. And then existentialism, how to live an individual, authentic life, and that experience is important to life. Okay, and these are just different breakdowns of these eras. Okay, so
what about the science-based thinking? Is it a separate philosophy or is it not?
What about science-based thinking? So actually, science influences philosophy in many ways, and actually, again, science kind of spins. The early scientists were actually called natural philosophers, and most people are familiar with Copernicus, right? The heliocentric
Okay.
model of the universe versus the Earth-centric view of the world. And there are many. I think science influences the sorts of questions that people have been asking over time. And as we find answers, like what is the nature of the atom? Before we know that, people tried to find answers to those, and they as the models of the atomic theory and so forth evolve, and as we find scientific answers to those things, like we find out about the atom and neutrons and protons, and there's still always some boundary that we don't know. Like is heterotic 11-dimensional superstring membranes, are those real or not real? What is what are Higgs bosons? Are we moving? Is gravity explained by a Higgs boson? Are we moving through a sea of Higgs bosons? Does that explain gravity? We don't really know, right? But as maybe 100 years from now, we'll find out the answer to those, and we'll chip away more at sort of the unknown, right? But you can imagine 2,000 years ago, there was a lot more that we didn't know, and philosophers were asking those sorts of questions. But as science kind of grew a lot in the Renaissance, we came to understand our world better, and so philosophers explored other things that we didn't know, right? So there's a strong and tight inner relationship, I think, between those two things. But there's also a lot of chapters in my book on science itself, so there are lots of key big ideas in science. But again, today I want to talk about philosophy because the audience here is probably very technical, so I'm hopefully pushing some of your mental boundaries by picking something that you may not know as much about. Okay, so I'm going to talk about next Socrates. So the number one periodic philosophical idea is the dialectic method, right? And like the periodic table of elements, I picked a couple letters here to represent the concept, and instead of atomic number, I have a date here. But they're periodic in the sense that in the periodic table of ideas, there are elements that on top of each other that have similar chemical properties. And similarly, I just kind of put them in columns where they fall under a domain. So Socrates, if we think about it, he founded no school. He was one of the most influential philosophers in history, and he developed something called the dialectic method, or what we today call the Socratic method. And it's a cooperative exploratory process using conversational dialogue to ask and answer questions, right? So he's famous for essentially asking a lot of deep probing questions to explore a subject. So this method, the dialectic method, is essentially a method to have people specifically hold different viewpoints with the aim of establishing the truth through reasoned argumentation. And the goal is to encourage critical thinking, to coax out assumptions, and identify contradictions in order to improve a hypothesis. So the dialogue is aimed at eliminating or finding a hypothesis which might have contradictory elements, and it involves three major stages: a thesis, which states an idea; an antithesis is a reaction that contradicts or negates that thesis; and then a synthesis between those two things. So, and everybody at some point needs to think, and especially in what we do, we're probably thinking all the time, right? So this is and if you read his things, he's not necessarily tackling technical subjects, but this process of discussion and discourse, and this process of the dialectic method, I think, is interesting just to learn about, right? So as a hypothesis, you first ask some challenging open-ended question as a basis to explore a subject. You might already have a problem that you're tackling, but But then you develop some possible explanation or solution for the question or problem. You want to think critically and develop ideas that might contribute to a solution, phrasing insights in the form of questions and using those questions to explore a subject and establish a foundation of what's known. So the hallmark of his idea is really just thinking about and asking these sorts of deep probing questions about a subject, and purposely asking questions that might contradict or might if you have a strong opinion about something, maybe think about the opposite of that something. And even though you might not want to think about that opposite of something, it might push your thinking in a different direction. So identify weaknesses or contradictions in an explanation or hypothesis, looking for things that are logical. And then in a group, you might have a moderator to ask questions, to interrogate the proposal and find weaknesses in a hypothesis. And the whole thing is with the aim of iterating. So through this step-by-step process, you iterate, you revise, and you arrive at something better than what you started with. So I'll stop here for a question as well.
During Socrates' time, if I remember correctly, he was killed, right? Nobody else was believing him.
Yes. He was actually killed because he was accused of corrupting the youth. And he's also famous for basically the phrase, the life which is unexamined is not worth living, right? So if we take, for example, the thought, the only life that is worth living is a good life, but you can only live a good life if you know what good and evil are. And if good and evil are relative or are they absolute, those sorts of things, what is good, what is evil, what is, are those concepts relative or are they absolute? Those are the sorts of things that can be found through this process of questioning and reasoning. So he says, he writes that morality and knowledge are bound together in some way, and in an unquestioning life and one of ignorance is one of without morality. So he arrives at this sort of conclusion that life that's is not examined is not worth living, right? So so he's a very interesting philosopher to study, and of the ancient philosophers, I mean, he's had obviously a lot of influence.
One of his students also became popular, I believe, right?
Yes. So so Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they're all so that the process of the dialectic method was also basically developed by Aristotle. And again, like Socrates himself wrote no book. Like he literally didn't write any book. It was just his students through his students that we find out who did publish things, who we find out a lot more about the Socratic method. Yeah. So, okay. All right, let me move on. Yeah, if I may, and we'll hold on. If you want to come back to this, we'll come back to this, but move on. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so in psychology, so the word psychology has its roots in the Greek word psyche, meaning mind, and logia, or meaning study. And psychology is the study of mind, behavior, and the collection of behaviors, traits, and attitudes that characterize an individual. So philosophy are the ideas about ideas, and psychology is the study of the human mind and behavior. So science ideas embodies knowledge about nature, and science is progressed by applying scientific methods to philosophical questions to arrive at practical knowledge. Psychology wrestles with philosophical questions relating to the mind and human behavior and cognitive processes. But those are things that are pretty hard to study, like psychology wants, its discipline is about attention, behavior, creativity, decision-making, language, memory, motivation, perception, problem solving, and thinking. But these things are intrinsically really hard to study. Like how do I study somebody's creativity? That's not easy to make scientific sort of rules about, right? So these at first were pretty slow to transform philosophical speculation into something that's practical. It took quite some time for that to happen. And again, this is straight out of my book as well, this text, this paragraph. And just to give you an idea, I mean, there are times where I would take a couple weeks to write a paragraph, right? So, oftentimes I cut and paste things out of my book because I gave a lot of thought to some of these words, and I wasn't going to do any better, right? So, all right, but today I'll talk a little bit also about some of the areas of psychology and some of the big key pivotal points in psychology, and again, trying to capture a couple thousand years worth of psychology in a single slide. So there are some big key areas in psychology. Biological psychology deals with sensation and consciousness. Cognitive psychology deals with perception, thinking, memory, and mental processes. Developmental psychology deals with learning and development. Social psychology deals with personality, emotion, motivation, and mental health. Maybe this is what we often think of as, when you first think of the word psychology, you think about abnormality and ill mental health and therapy and stress and those sorts of things. But there's many dimensions of psychology as well. So I mentioned that at first it was indeed very hard to study the mind. I mean, that's not something that's very easy to study. And so the behaviorists and the behaviorism was very popular. That was one of the first big areas of psychology. And so they said, well, if we can't directly study the mind itself, maybe we can study behavior. If I do A and I ring a bell and I watch a dog salivate and I see some correlation between something happening and a behavior or something, I can note that, I can record that, and maybe I can make some sort of theory from that. So behaviorism became one of the first major foundations of modern psychology. Next, of course, maybe one of the most famous and still most famous figures in psychology is Sigmund Freud, right? So he, working with Joseph Brauer, noticed that, wow, they had a patient that, patient O, I think it was the name. If you just let a person talk, they get better. If you just have a person talk about their problems and they can offload their problems to somebody listening, they remarkably get better. So he studied behavior. He had, of course, the id, the superego, and the ego were his ideas, but this idea of psychotherapy, the having a patient talk about their problems was quite revolutionary. Next, we come around the time of World War II and after World War II, where computers became an information processing, and of course, these Claude Shannon, those sorts of things are near and dear to our heart. So the developments of computer technology and information sciences and those sorts of things really allowed people to think of the mind as an information processor, and it changed the way people thought about the mind and modeled the mind as an information processor, which got people to think about the areas of cognitive psychology in a different way. And Kurt Lewin serves as, he's seen as the father of social psychology, and he has this thing called field theory, where he talks about how basically the environment affects you, and you affect your environment, and that groups of people play a crucial role in how we think and how we influence and how we interact with the world. Piaget is famous for his studies on child development, his 4 stages of development, from a sensory motor stage where children are first learning about motor skills, to the pre-operational stage where they make symbolic representations of their world and images, to the concrete operational stage where they first develop reasoning, classifications, and manipulation of sets, to a formal operation stage where we can think about our future and make abstractions and think about ethics and morals. And then I'll talk more about the psychology of difference in Gordon Allport, and that name you probably haven't heard of, I'm guessing. So that is the psychology periodic idea number 1 that I'll be spending more time on personality of traits here. So, and I'll stop here for a question. Sip of water here. Any questions to this point? Not, I'll move on. Okay, so again, I mentioned that the mind is a very difficult thing to observe and really to make scientific headway on in the in the 1800s and early 1900s. But John B. Watson is the father of behaviorism. So if you hear that name, John Watson, he's the father of behaviorism, and many others followed in his footsteps: Thorndike, Ed Tolman, Ed Guthrie, Ivan Pavlov. And of course, most people have heard of Ivan Pavlov with conditioning and stimulus response, and then B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning. So, again, if we can't observe the mind directly, if we can't atomically figure out atom by atom what's going on in the mind, maybe we can observe behavior, and that's the basis of behaviorism. Sigmund Freud with psychopathology and observation case histories, and he talks about unconscious thought, that the unconsciousness we may not know. So the notion that you are guided by things about your brain that you don't know about was pretty new, right? That whole the idea that unconscious thought can guide conscious behavior was revolutionary in his time. Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, and psychotherapy, and Ed Alice with rational emotive behavior therapy, saying that if something happens to you, if you look at it rationally, you can alter your behavior, and rather than just react from pure emotion, if you just step back and think about something rationally, that itself is therapeutic, right? So that rational approach to something, take a step back, take a breath, and think about it. Things might not be as bad as you might think they are. Okay, so it's cognitive psychology and the study of mental processes. After World War II, the development of neuroscience, the Hebb neuronal associative learning. You might have heard of the phrase neurons that fire together, wire together, right? So that was that sort of reinforcement type learning from neuronal associative learning. The Donald Broadbent pushing that this information process model of the brain, George Miller, Jerome Bruner, and whose study of memory, perception, and emotion were crucial. And of course, Alan Turing. You might have heard of the Turing test, and how do we know if something is intelligent if you're having a discussion with an artificially intelligent thing. Okay, and we come to social psychology with group dynamics and attitudes, prejudice, social conflict, conformity, obedience, social change. These are areas or aspects of social psychology. Kurt Lewin, again, is the grandfather of social psychology. He says that man is a product of his environment, and that the environment affects the man, and the man affects the environment and attribution. There's lots of famous studies. The Ash experiment, this is the line experiment, where basically, and there's a diagram in my book about this, but basically, so there were people who in the study who basically said, which is if I show you three lines, A, B, and C, lines A, line B, line C, and line A is clearly shorter than the other two lines. If you can manipulate people to say that A is actually not the shortest line because they're trying to conform to others, right? And there's other conformity experiments, the Milgram experiment, the famous Zimbardo prison experiment, where 24 people were in a prison, and people who were prison guards quickly got into that mindset of being kind of brutal and being a guard and being a bully, and then prisoners who got into that sort of prison mentality, and there was a BBC experiment that followed that on some decades later as well, similar to that. Robert Zajonc, the mere exposure effect, I talk about this in my book as well, where basically if you're exposed to something more frequently, you become sort of more endearing endearing to that thing. And a good example of that is the Mona Lisa, right? So the Mona Lisa wasn't really that well known, actually, before it was stolen. But because it took 2 years to try to recover that painting, people were just constantly pelted in the media with and constantly saw things about the Mona Lisa. And today it's seen as one of the most famous paintings. And that's a good example of the mere exposure effect. Okay, so I talked about developmental psychology, but there are other psychologists who proposed other stages. Erikson's stage model, the Lawrence Kohlberg's six-stage model of development, and John Bowlby's attachment theory. And then I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about the psychology of difference here as we get into the periodic table of idea number 1 for psychology, the personality traits. So it's marked by the symbol PT in 1937. So personality traits, when you think about it, we all work with people. We all have to get along with people. We all have to, try to work together on things. And we're all interacting with people every day. And as a result, it's really important, I think, to understand a little bit more about personality, because that'll help you get along with other people, right? We're all different. But psychology asks, well, how are we different? Are there ways that we can study or characterize people in some way to help us understand them better? And is that a meaningful thing to ask? Are there certain traits and things and personality? We all have a sense that people have personalities, but are there ways to really study that systematically, right? So Hippocrates first proposed that there are 4 fundamental personality types: a sanguine, pleasure-seeking; a choleric, ambitious; melancholic, analytic; and phlegmatic, thoughtful. But John B. Watson, again, I mentioned that he was the grandfather of behaviorism. He asserted that personality is a product of conditioning and the environment. And psychoanalytic theories also plays a crucial role in this understanding as well. Sigmund Freud, and I mentioned Joseph Breuer, focused on the unconscious mind. I mentioned also the unconscious mind, asserting that personality is composed of the ego and superego, so that notion that the unconscious mind plays a big role in your personality and what you like and what you do and your everyday living was somewhat revolutionary in his time. But the grandfather of personality traits study was really kicked off by Gordon Allport and Henry Odbert. They basically studied personality and identified 17,953 words. And I downloaded these all in a list. All these words to describe personalities. They sort of sat back and said, what if we just found every single possible word we can find to identify personalities? And that's the list they came up with. But if you look at this list, and I have looked at this list, there are actually lots of sort of repeats, and there are lots of synonyms of the similar sorts of things. And so they boiled those down to 4,504 adjectives eventually. But one thing they said is that personality is really a combination of 3 basic fundamental categories of things. One is cardinal traits, another is common traits, and the third is secondary traits. So they say cardinal traits are fundamental. They're really a big building blocks. They're really basic in governing an entire approach to life, motivating essential drive, core needs, and desires of a person. Common traits are general characteristics that are general building blocks of personality. And then finally, secondary traits are just other things that are contextual and situationally based, where you might express a preference or an attitude. So again, Gordon Allport was a pioneer in trait theory, and psychologists today acknowledge that people are really a medley of personality traits. So here's a little bit of a timeline of personality traits. So this, what I mentioned before, that 17,593 words, is today called the lexical hypothesis. So Allport and Odbert first basically proposed that, maybe we can study personality through a lexicon, right? Raymond Cattell in 1946 refined these 4,504 adjectives down to 171 adjectives into a more manageable set. And he basically boils that down even more in 1957 into what's called the 16 PF this personality test. And if you look at a test, it's kind of like a little zigzaggy graph, and you're kind of like on a scale on each one of these 16 things. I haven't taken the test myself, but I've seen like how they're graphed. So they're abstractness, aggressiveness, anxiety, assertiveness, dutifulness, emotional stability, independence, intellect, introversion, liveliness, open-mindedness, paranoia, perfection, social sensitivity, tension, and warmth. So those are his 16 PF models. And then there's there's social cognition as well is also important in a role in personality and personality development, and some key things there. So behavior arises from cognition and process thinking and judgment. Albert Bandura performed this famous, what's called the Bobo doll experiment, where basically kids were shown this Bobo doll, and adults who abused the Bobo doll and the kids who watched the adults abuse the Bobo doll themselves also abused the Bobo doll. And the opposite was true as well. Adults that were shown to show care and loving towards the Bobo doll, the kids followed suit. So that was a very interesting experiment. You can take a look. And then there are other things like CST and personal construct psychology that says that the development of self-theory of your sense of self is governed by these 11 different factors and other things like that. So humanistic theory, as well as the next stage, where many people you've probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, from psychological needs to safety needs to social needs to esteem needs and self-actualization at the top of the pyramid. And he says self-actualization has 4 key dimensions: awareness, reality, problem-centered, acceptance and spontaneity, and is democratic, has value of diversity. And in 1961, Ernest Tupes and Raymond Christel came up with what is today now the most widely used model of personality, and it's called the 5-factor model. And my next slide will go into that in a little bit more detail. But basically, the 5 big traits are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. Now you can remember this as the acronym CANOE, C-A-N-O-E, or OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N. Okay, so this is kind of a little bit of a timeline of what's called the psychology of difference, and if you hear that term, the psychology of difference, it's basically the study of personality, right? And this is the sort of the evolution of that discipline in psychology. Okay, so I'll stop here for a question. Is there any thoughts or questions or?
Lots of good details. What is extroversion?
Extroversion is, okay, so actually let me go to the next slide, that'll help you. Okay. So in each of these big 5 areas, one, agreeableness is characterized by trust, morality, altruism, cooperation, modesty, and sympathy. So it's basically how sort of helpful and agreeable and how well you are likely to cooperate with somebody, showing sympathy towards another, how trusting are you. Those are sorts of so if you read and study the big 5 personality traits model like I have, you'll find that also there's also sub aspects of the major trait, right? So there's different sub dimensions to each of these, which also helps you understand the major thing. So conscientiousness is also characterized by competence, organization, dutifulness, achievement, willpower, cautiousness. So I write in my book, basically, for example, if somebody is very, say, conscientious, and I give different examples, but you may appeal to maybe their sense of achievement, and they're looking, if this is very important to them, they'll want to be very they'll approach problems maybe in a very organized manner, or they may be looking to, achievement may drive them much more strongly than say other factors that like money, wealth, power. This I want to achieve something and make a lasting mark in the world. Extroversion is characterized by kindness, gregariousness, assertiveness, temperament, excitement, and cheerfulness. So, and we all have a sense of introversion or extroversion. How outgoing is this person, and these are this sort of or how gregarious is this person, and so I give a sense in my book. I say, if somebody is not very gregarious, you wouldn't want to say invite them necessarily to a 10,000 person convention. Maybe to appeal to that person, you might suggest just a small gathering to accomplish something, or based on their temperament, you might approach them in some way. If they're very excitable, maybe you want to not try to excite them in order to work with them better, right? Neuroticism is somebody's sense of anxiety or hostility, their depression or self-consciousness, their impulsiveness, their vulnerability. So if somebody is a very anxious person, maybe, or is easily feels vulnerable, maybe when you're working with somebody in this dimension, maybe you can, and if you're aware of that, maybe you want to reassure them, or find ways to build a foundation such that they can feel secure before moving on, right? And that sort of thing will help you work with that kind of person. Openness, embodied by imagination and aesthetics, emotionality and adventurousness and curiosity and tolerance. So some people are very open to new ideas, very adventurous. I write in my book, if somebody is not very adventurous, you wouldn't necessarily want to take them skydiving, but maybe you want to find a more tame activity, first. So, and the subtitle of my book is not just history-changing ideas, but why they matter to you, right? So there are, like, the wheel is not a technological idea, even though arguably maybe it's one of the most important ideas, or the steam engine or atomic power. Those things didn't make the list because they're not necessarily likely to matter to you, right? It's not clear how an atomic reactor might directly matter to you, and that's why a lot of the psychology ideas do matter to you every day, because you have to work with people every day. And I give every single chapter in my book has a section about why this idea might matter to you. So I write about these different areas and give you examples of and this is just a picture straight out of my book that I drew that might help you understand this idea and how it might help you work with people. Okay, so I'm reached the end of my presentation, so I have a few minutes left for questions and answers, unless Devaki, you want to move on with. I think you had some other items in your agenda, so if you want, I can stop here as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for an excellent presentation. Yeah, definitely look forward to reading your book as well. Lots of great ideas.
Yeah. Also, my book. So I worked also with a recording studio. My book is also available on Audible.com. If you want to listen to the book, you can also find it that way.
That's excellent.
Yeah, very good. I got one question.
Sure.
In this table, when you look at it, the paragraph PT is at number 1. If you go back to the table.
Yeah. This one. Yeah.
No, the first table. The first. The very first table you had.
First table.
The first slide you had.
The first slide I had. Okay, let me go back.
The one which you are showing a few seconds ago. Yeah.
Oh, a few seconds ago. Sorry.
The table which you're showing, periodic table, where you said the second title. And, this is fine.
Yeah.
So, question is, what is the logic in this ordering? Like DM is number 1.
So the ordering is pretty simple. It's just by date. So that's actually a very insightful question, and I could probably talk for hours about writing books. This is the 6th book I've written, so the process of writing a book is very interesting as well. You have to really love the topic that you're writing about. But this book took a few years to write. but really, it's really the product of decades of interest in these different areas, right? Like you don't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to write about the 50 major ideas in the universe. Like you had to have some interest in all of these things kind of to begin with, right? So I had at first organized these things alphabetically, and then I thought it made more sense to order them by date. So the very simple ordering is they're just ordered by date, by ascending date.
So the first date means whenever you wrote it. That's the date.
The date means the when that idea first became relevant and was invented, right? So yeah. So
it's in the order of those events
yes,
that map to those DM,
right,
EM, and PS.
Then why do you call a PT number 1? What is the significant calling it number 1?
It's just the, there's five psychology periodic ideas, and it happens to be the first one because it's the earliest in time. Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry. So actually, I also have in chapter 64 of my book, I group these in slightly different ways, and they're grouped by function. I grouped them also to show you that there are ideas that relate to individuals, to groups, mental tools, and practical tools. So there are other ways to think about or group these ideas, and I suggest I have that as also a different grouping as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
So can I have one question?
Sure.
Second,
yeah, go ahead.
Thank
and
you.
then we'll wrap up.
All right, sorry. Yeah, so with regard to this, I know it kind of spans, when I look at it, it spans between, you can listen from a human resources standpoint on the business side, or departmental, and just dealing basically with people. And then in addition to that, it's like I look at different personalities, and I notice too that it can also be catered to where we are today from a political standpoint. When you decided to write the book, did you look at it more from a business standpoint, or was it something that could also be used outside of business and organizations, politics, whatever?
So kind of what dimension did I if I understood your question right, did I write, what angle kind of did I write the book from? So that's a really really astute question, and you may not know how deep of a question that is. But basically, I had to kind of put myself in different shoes as I was writing these different things, and I, I'm an engineer, right? And my PhD in operations research is very mathematically oriented, and so to kind of explore these sort of business things and things that are really outside my domain, my natural sort of working domain, you have to sort of think about things differently as well. And it also really is important to know the sort of journey I've taken on writing books as well. So my first book, the 32 Innovation Factors, was really an engineering book for engineers, written by an engineer, right? But my next books, I wanted to be much more accessible to people, and so the book, my previous book, The 4 Elements of Thinking, is really a book about, it's really a book about helping people think better, right? So identifying what are the sort of key elements of thinking, those being reason, creativity, synthesis, and evaluation. But if I said, the key areas of, if you weren't just looking at this, and if I said, the key areas of thinking are reasoning, creativity, synthesis, and evaluation, that's not necessarily easy to remember or easy for you to apply. But if I asked you to remember earth, air, fire, and water, that's probably a whole lot easier to remember and very easy to rattle off in your head, right? So what if we associated reasoning with earth thinking, creativity with air, synthesis with water, and evaluation with fire, burning things away? That kind of thing lets you apply those thoughts. So in the periodic table ideas, I wanted to tie not just these big pie in the sky ideas, but how these ideas might matter to you. And to do that, of course, you have to, every chapter, you have to think about why it's relevant to somebody, and you know, the question of also which every writer, especially when you're writing a nonfiction book on a topic like this, you have to struggle with sort of who is my audience, you know, and you know, is it a scientist, is it a housewife, is it a child, is it, you know, somebody who's retired? So it's not easy, right? And I try to write as broadly as I can, appealing to people in many different circumstances from all walks of life. And I've been blessed with just knowing people from many different walks of life. And that's really broadened my perspective. You know, traveling around 30 countries around the world has also really helped me with that as well. So you'll find if you do pick up my book that I try to write, you know, the things from a pretty broad perspective, written for anybody, just the person, you know, just a common person off the street. And I think that you'll find, hopefully, you'll find things that will be useful to you. Okay, sorry, I ran over.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent. Okay, so let's, so we are a bit over time, but hopefully we can still discuss the next 10 minutes about the